Chapter 1. A Glimpse Behind the Veil. In the grand drawing room of Somerville Manor, Eleanor Sinclair stood by the wide, arched window, gazing upon the sprawling grounds that seemed to stretch endlessly. The estate was a fortress of tradition, built to keep up appearances and conceal secrets beneath layers of propriety. Outside, the morning mist clung to the rolling hills, lending the scene a mysterious allure that suited Eleanor's contemplative mood. She had always found herself at odds with this life of privilege, a world of corsets and curtsies, constrained by etiquette and expectation. To the guests gathered for Lord and Lady Sinclair's mid-autumn ball, she was merely another lady, expected to perform, to smile, to remain as graceful as a statue. Yet in her heart, Eleanor harbored a fierce desire for something beyond the gilded cage of her upbringing. As the only daughter of a family laden with ancient titles but dwindling fortune, Eleanor was not just a Sinclair. She was a cornerstone of her parents' ambitions to restore their standing. Every gesture and every glance was scrutinized by those who saw her as an investment, rather than as a soul longing for freedom. But as Eleanor observed the fog drifting across the moors, she found herself inexplicably drawn to a feeling she couldn't name. A whisper that called her away from the security of Somerville and into the unknown. That day, in the soft glow of dawn, a letter had arrived, its seal plain, without any noble crest or sign of wealth. The handwriting was unfamiliar, bearing no hint of its author's identity. Inside, the ink was fresh, yet the words spoke as though from another time, echoing with a depth and urgency that had left her heart trembling. The letter spoke of a shared legacy, a tie between their families buried under years of secrecy, and a promise of truth she'd never known. It was unsigned, but it hinted at someone who knew her lineage better than she did herself. Someone who bore knowledge that could unravel generations of Sinclair pride and deception. Inwardly, Eleanor felt a surge of something akin to defiance. If there was indeed a truth hidden from her, she was determined to uncover it. A long-buried family secret was not what she'd expected, but in her heart, Eleanor felt as though the letter was a message sent to her and her alone. A beckoning to find a purpose outside the meticulously arranged lines of her life. The voice within her urged her to embrace it, to see where it might lead her. The day's light faded, casting an amber glow over the manor's vast, imposing structure. The preparations for the evening's ball went on around her, servants moving swiftly to ensure the night's perfection. But Eleanor felt removed from it all, as though her heart and mind were elsewhere, perhaps in the shadows cast by the strange letter. Dressed in her finest gown, she descended the grand staircase, yet her mind was already somewhere else, anticipating the hour when she might slip away from the ball and follow the path this letter had set before her. The manor filled with guests as the evening drew on, each of them arriving with a mask of polished respectability. Eleanor moved among them, noting faces she knew all too well, friends of her parents, young men sent by families eager to see their sons wed as Sinclair, and even Lady Ashbury, with her eagle-eyed scrutiny, who had never approved of Eleanor's unconventional spirit. Yet none of them noticed the quiet resolve in Eleanor's bearing that night, or the unusual gleam in her eye. Beneath her refined exterior, her heart beat with an urgency that was all but invisible to those around her. At the appointed hour, as the guests were occupied by the lively strains of the string quartet, Eleanor made her escape. Slipping down a side corridor, she left behind the warmth of the ballroom and ventured out into the misty night. Her heart raced as she moved away from the grandeur of Somerville Manor, her steps tentative yet resolute, following the vague directions outlined in the mysterious letter. Through a dense cluster of ancient oaks and up a winding path hidden from the main grounds, Eleanor walked deeper into the unknown. She knew little of what lay ahead or of who might await her. The air grew cool and damp, wrapping her in an eerie stillness broken only by her footsteps crunching softly along the forest path. A strange feeling took root within her, a peculiar blend of trepidation and exhilaration, a sense that she was finally shedding the trappings of her carefully constructed world and stepping into her own. At last, she reached the clearing described in the letter. A solitary figure stood there, half shrouded in shadow. The figure turned, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of piercing eyes that seemed to carry a weight as heavy as her own. His face was obscured by the fog, but his presence was unmistakable, like a dark silhouette etched into her mind. He was no gentleman of her world, no suitor she had met in the circles of society. This man had an air of mystery and purpose unlike any she'd ever known. The moment was suspended in the quiet of the night, two strangers drawn together by a thread of fate yet unseen. Eleanor's pulse quickened, for she sensed that this meeting, this man, would change the course of her life in ways she could not yet fathom. As she took another step forward, her heart surged with a new determination. Here, beyond the walls of Somerville Manor and in the shadowed presence of this unknown figure, she felt the first true stirrings of a life yet unlived, a life her heart had always yearned for, though she hadn't dared to imagine it until now. Chapter 2. The Weight of Expectations. The morning sun cast a tentative glow over Somerville Manor, brushing the ivy-covered walls and filling the grand corridors with soft light. Eleanor awoke with the memory of the night before still clinging to her mind, like the lingering scent of roses from the garden below her window. She recalled the man in the forest, his shadowed figure, and the air of secrecy he carried. The encounter had left her with more questions than answers, yet it ignited a fierce curiosity within her, a hunger to uncover the truth that lay buried beneath her family's legacy. As the eldest daughter of Lord and Lady Sinclair, Eleanor had long been trained to move gracefully through the intricate dance of high society, her every gesture and expression carefully crafted to reflect the dignity of the Sinclair name. Yet in recent years, that dignified existence had felt increasingly stifling. Each year of her life seemed to tighten the chains around her, binding her to a future that did not feel her own. The letter, and the mysterious man it had led her to, was unlike anything in the carefully arranged lines of her life. For once, she felt as though she had glimpsed the possibility of something genuine, a spark of freedom from the relentless expectations imposed upon her. As she made her way down to breakfast, Eleanor could already hear her mother's voice wafting through the hall. Lady Sinclair was directing the servants with her characteristic precision, her sharp voice slicing through the morning quiet like a blade. Seated at the grand table in the breakfast room, Lord Sinclair hid behind his newspaper, his silence unging the vast gulf between him and his wife. Though they shared the same space, they lived in different worlds. Lady Sinclair ruled the household with a rigid sense of order, while Lord Sinclair retreated further into his solitude with each passing year. Eleanor joined them, slipping into her seat and folding her hands demurely in her lap. Yet even as she performed this familiar ritual, her thoughts wandered back to the figure in the forest. The memory of his piercing gaze lingered in her mind, unsettling her. She wondered who he was, why he had summoned her, and what secrets he held that might shake the foundations of her world. Her thoughts drifted to the letter's cryptic message, hinting at a hidden bond between their families. What lay behind such a connection? A scandalous love affair buried in the past? A shared debt? Or perhaps even a feud kept hidden for years? Lady Sinclair's voice broke through Eleanor's reverie, pulling her back to the reality of her station. Her mother spoke of plans for the season, of suitors and social events, of the necessity for Eleanor to secure a marriage that would restore the Sinclair fortunes and preserve their status. Every word was laden with expectation, a reminder that Eleanor was not merely a person, but an instrument of her family's ambition. The weight of her duty pressed down upon her, stifling any notions of freedom or personal choice. Yet beneath the facade of dutiful compliance, Eleanor felt a surge of defiance. The encounter in the forest had sparked something within her, a desire to seek out the truth, regardless of the consequences. She knew that the life her parents had envisioned for her, a respectable marriage to a well-connected gentleman, a life confined to hosting lavish gatherings and raising heirs, was not the life she desired. Her heart yearned for something more, for the chance to write her own story rather than merely following the script set before her. After breakfast, Eleanor excused herself, retreating to the library under the guise of studying her father's extensive collection of literature. In truth, she sought refuge in the quiet solitude of the room, hoping to gather her thoughts and perhaps uncover any clue to the identity of the man she'd met. The library was a sanctuary of silence, its shelves lined with volumes spanning centuries, each book a testament to the knowledge and wealth that her family had accumulated over generations. She moved slowly through the rows, running her fingers along the leather-bound spines, searching for something she could not name. As she scanned the shelves, her eyes fell upon a tome she had never noticed before. A small, unassuming book with a faded cover and no title. Curiosity piqued, Eleanor pulled it from the shelf, feeling a chill as she opened its worn pages. Inside, she found a collection of handwritten notes, scrawled in a familiar script. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the handwriting. It was her father's, yet the words on the page were unlike anything she had ever seen him write. They spoke of an ancient debt, a pact made with a family she did not recognize, bound by blood and sealed in secrecy. As she read further, Eleanor's breath caught. The pact described in her father's handwriting bore striking similarities to the mysterious letter she had received. The words hinted at a betrayal, a promise broken, and a lingering shadow that hung over both families. She could scarcely believe what she was reading, yet the evidence was there, etched into the yellowed pages of the book. The discovery left Eleanor reeling. She had always known her family harbored secrets, but this revelation went beyond anything she could have imagined. She closed the book carefully, slipping it back onto the shelf and taking a steadying breath. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement. Fear for what might lie ahead, and excitement for the path she was now determined to follow. Whatever secrets her family hid, she would uncover them. She could no longer stand idly by, bound by the constraints of her birth. The weight of her family's expectations still pressed upon her, but she felt a new resolve rising within her, a strength that had lain dormant until now. The day passed in a haze, with Eleanor moving through the motions of her duties, her mind racing with thoughts of the pact, the letter, and the mysterious man. Each moment felt like a trial of patience, an exercise in restraint as she waited for nightfall, for the moment when she could once again venture beyond the walls of Somerville Manor and seek the truth that lay hidden in the shadows. As dusk descended and the household settled into its evening routines, Eleanor slipped quietly from her room, her footsteps soundless on the polished floors. She moved like a ghost through the corridors, her heart pounding with anticipation and a hint of dread. She knew the risks she was taking, yet she felt compelled to follow the path that had opened before her, to uncover the answers that lay just beyond her reach. The air outside was thick with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, a reminder of the fleeting nature of the season. Eleanor took a steadying breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. She moved swiftly through the grounds, her steps confident and purposeful, as though guided by an unseen force. In the distance, she saw the shadowy outline of the forest, its ancient trees standing like silent sentinels in the darkness. Her heart raced as she approached the edge of the woods, her resolve unshaken. She knew that this journey would lead her down a path of uncertainty and danger, yet she felt an undeniable pull to continue. She had lived her life in the shadows of others' expectations, But tonight, she would take her first step toward claiming her own destiny. Chapter 3. Through the Haze of Secrets. Night had descended fully upon Somerville Manor by the time Eleanor slipped into the forest's shadow once more, her heart pounding with the thrill of the unknown. The cool, crisp air filled her lungs as she walked, the muffled sound of her footfall sinking into the moss and damp leaves. She felt the weight of silence around her, yet it was not a silence of solitude. It was thick with expectation, as though the forest itself awaited her next move. A silver sliver of moonlight peeked through the bare branches, casting eerie shadows along the forest floor. The image of her father's cryptic notes lingered in her mind, the faded ink and hurried strokes hinting at a long-buried family pact that bound the Sinclairs to an obligation kept secret for generations. Her mind whirled with questions that seemed to have no answer, leaving her unsettled yet determined. Every word she had read urged her forward, like a compass guiding her deeper into the unknown. At last, she reached the clearing where she had met the mysterious figure the night before. Though the space was empty now, Eleanor felt his presence, as though he had left a piece of himself here in the solitude of the woods. Her pulse quickened, the memory of his intense gaze still vivid in her mind. She wondered if he would come again, or if she would be left to seek answers alone. For a moment, Eleanor felt a pang of disappointment, a feeling she quickly pushed aside. She reminded herself that her quest was no mere romantic adventure. It was a matter of uncovering her family's truth, of pulling away the carefully woven veil that had obscured her understanding of who she truly was. She had lived her life tethered to her family's reputation, to their rules and expectations. But here, in the cool stillness of the forest, she felt free, unchained from the gilded cage of Somerville Manor and its suffocating legacy. As she lingered in the clearing, a sudden rustling behind her sent a shiver down her spine. She turned quickly, her heart pounding as her eyes searched the shadows. There, half concealed by the dense underbrush, lay an object partially covered in leaves and dirt. She approached it cautiously, bending down to brush the soil away. Her fingers trembled as she unearthed what appeared to be a locket, its surface tarnished, its clasp stubbornly sealed by years of neglect. Eleanor's breath caught as she examined the locket more closely. It was intricately carved, bearing an emblem that felt strangely familiar, though she could not place it. The craftsmanship was unmistakably fine, a relic of a time long past. She wondered if it had once belonged to a Sinclair, or perhaps to a member of the family mentioned in her father's notes, the family whose fate seemed intertwined with her own. This small, forgotten trinket felt like a clue, a bridge between her world and a hidden past that waited just beyond her reach. She slipped the locket into her pocket, feeling its weight against her thigh as she stood. The discovery only deepened her resolve, as though the forest itself had offered her a token, urging her to continue her search. The night felt colder now, the air charged with a tension that sent a chill through her. She had uncovered something small yet meaningful, a tangible reminder of the mystery that bound her family to another. Whatever this locket represented, she felt certain that it held a key to the secrets she sought to uncover. Making her way back to the manor, Eleanor felt the weight of her actions settling upon her. She had crossed an invisible line that night, stepping beyond the boundaries set by her family and society. Yet she did not feel regret, only a fierce determination to continue. If the truth lay hidden in the shadows of her family's past, then she would bring it into the light, no matter the cost. By the time she slipped into her chambers, the manor was silent, its halls bathed in moonlight. Eleanor placed the locket on her dressing table, studying its worn surface in the dim light. A part of her longed to pry it open, to discover what secrets it might hold, but something held her back. She felt a strange reverence for the object, as though it were a piece of history too sacred to disturb without first understanding its true significance. The following morning dawned bright and clear, casting a warm glow over the manor's sprawling grounds. Yet as Eleanor moved through the day's routines, she felt a growing sense of unease. Her mind was filled with the night's events, with the locket and the notes in her father's hand. She longed to confide in someone, to share the weight of her discoveries, but she knew that was impossible. No one in her family would understand her curiosity, nor would they support her pursuit of answers that could threaten the Sinclair reputation. By afternoon, Eleanor found herself once again drawn to the library. She hoped to find more traces of the past, more clues that might shed light on her family's secretive pact. She moved through the shelves slowly, her fingers brushing against the spines of the books as though hoping one would call out to her. At last, her eyes settled upon a leather-bound journal, its edges frayed and pages yellowed with age. She pulled it from the shelf, feeling a shiver of anticipation as she opened its cover. Inside, the journal was filled with entries written in a hand she did not recognize, each page filled with musings on loyalty, honor, and family duty. The words were intense, bearing a raw honesty that struck Eleanor deeply. They spoke of a bond between two families, a debt repaid with silence and secrecy. Eleanor's heart raced as she read the journal, her mind piecing together fragments of a story that seemed both foreign and familiar. One entry, in particular, caught her attention. The burden of our family's honor is one we must carry with pride, even as it binds us to another. Though time may pass and memory fade, we are forever linked by blood, by sacrifice, by the weight of our shared legacy. For in the end, it is not wealth or title that defines us, but the promises we keep, even in silence. The words struck Eleanor like a bolt of lightning, leaving her breathless. This was the legacy she had inherited, a bond that went beyond mere obligation. It was a promise made and kept in silence, a duty passed down through generations. Her family's wealth, their titles, their influence, all of it was bound to this hidden pact, a commitment that extended beyond time itself. As she closed the journal, Eleanor felt a mixture of awe and apprehension. She had uncovered the shadow that lay over her family, the unseen force that had shaped their lives. Yet she knew there was more to discover, more layers to peel back before she could truly understand the scope of this legacy. Night had fallen once more by the time she returned the journal to its place. The manor was quiet, its inhabitants unaware of the secrets that stirred within its walls. Eleanor felt the weight of those secrets pressing upon her, a burden she bore alone. Yet she did not feel fear. Instead, she felt a sense of purpose, a calling to uncover the truth and confront whatever lay hidden in the past. As she retired to her chambers that night, Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. She was no longer the compliant daughter, content to live within the confines of her family's expectations. She was a seeker, a keeper of secrets, a woman on a journey to uncover her own destiny. And though she did not yet know where that journey would lead, she felt a quiet certainty that it would change her life forever. The locket lay on her dressing table, its tarnished surface catching the faint light of the moon. Eleanor reached for it, feeling its cool weight in her hand. One day, she would uncover its secrets, just as she would uncover the secrets of her family's past. For now, she would keep it close, a silent reminder of the journey she had begun and the legacy she was bound to confront. Chapter 4. Shadows of Obligation. The morning dawned with a dull grayness that seemed to seep through Somerville Manor's thick stone walls. A heavy mist clung to the grounds, draping the gardens and forest in an eerie quiet that matched Eleanor's own somber mood. She lay awake, her gaze fixed on the locket she had uncovered in the woods, its tarnished surface a reminder of the night's discoveries and the secret legacy she now felt compelled to unearth. As the house stirred to life around her, Eleanor moved to her dressing table, the locket cool against her palm. It had become her talisman, the object anchoring her to the path she had chosen, though she still did not know where it might lead. She felt as though the weight of the manor's history pressed upon her, as though every object, every faded portrait, and every carved arch held whispers of the past she was so desperate to understand. That day, Eleanor was expected to join her family for breakfast in the grand dining hall. She dressed slowly, her mind still lingering on the worn journal she had discovered the night before. The words within those pages haunted her, hinting at a solemn bond that had tied the Sinclair family to another through generations. But who was this other family? And what was the purpose of this secret pact? She could not shake the feeling that the locket she now carried was a piece of that mystery, a link to something greater than herself. In the dining hall, her family sat with practiced decorum, their morning rituals a polished performance. Her mother's gaze swept over her, noting the slight pallor of Eleanor's complexion, a subtle reminder of the expectations placed upon her. The family spoke of trivial matters, her father commenting on estate business, her mother on social obligations, while her brother made an occasional remark to add a veneer of charm. Eleanor's thoughts drifted, her gaze lingering on the heavy silverware, the elaborate china, all symbols of the Sinclair legacy, a legacy she had once accepted unquestioningly. After breakfast, Eleanor found herself wandering the empty corridors of the manor, her feet carrying her without purpose. She felt a restlessness, a deep urge to escape the confines of the house and return to the mysteries hidden beyond its walls. Yet something kept her within, as though an invisible tether held her back, reminding her of the weight of her obligations and the expectations that had bound her since birth. She could feel the weight of her family's history pressing upon her, the quiet insistence of generations of Sinclairs whose lives had been shaped by unseen forces and silent promises. In a bid to calm her mind, Eleanor made her way to the library once more. It had become her sanctuary, the one place within the manor where she felt free to explore without judgment. She combed through the shelves with a renewed determination, her fingers brushing against volumes that seemed to vibrate with the echoes of forgotten voices. She knew that if the truth was to be found, it lay somewhere within these walls, hidden among the records of her ancestors. Hours passed as she sifted through documents, letters, and diaries, piecing together fragments of stories and lives long past. She discovered a collection of correspondence between her great-grandfather and a man whose name was unfamiliar to her. Yet the tone of the letters suggested an intimacy, a shared understanding that went beyond friendship. Eleanor's heart quickened as she read, feeling as though she were glimpsing a part of her family that had been deliberately concealed. The letters spoke of a debt of honor and binding trust, phrases that bore the weight of something monumental. Yet for all their poetic language, they revealed little about the true nature of the bond between the two families. Eleanor felt a sense of frustration welling within her. Each clue she uncovered seemed to open new questions rather than provide answers, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across time and memory. She rose from her seat, the letters clutched in her hand, and moved to one of the large windows that overlooked the grounds. The fog had lifted, revealing the bare trees and the winding path that led to the forest. She felt drawn to it once more, the call of the unknown stirring within her. Her gaze drifted beyond the familiar landscape, as though seeking something just out of reach, a truth hidden in plain sight, yet shrouded by years of secrecy. As evening approached, Eleanor found herself in the attic, a part of the house she had seldom visited. The air was thick with dust, the dim light casting long shadows across the forgotten trunks and covered furniture that filled the space. It was a place of discarded memories, the remnants of lives and stories left to fade with time. Yet Eleanor felt a strange sense of comfort here, as though the very age of the room offered her a connection to the past she sought to understand. She rummaged through the contents of an old trunk, uncovering faded clothing, trinkets, and letters addressed to long-deceased relatives. At the bottom of the trunk, she found a small wooden box, its lid carved with a familiar emblem, the same design etched onto the locket she had discovered in the woods. Her hands trembled as she lifted the box, feeling the weight of history within her grasp. Inside, she found a collection of items that seemed both mundane and profoundly significant. A faded photograph, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, and a ring that bore the same insignia as the locket. She studied the photograph, her heart pounding as she recognized the face of her great-grandfather alongside a man she did not know. A man whose dark eyes seemed to hold a secret of their own. They stood side by side, their expressions solemn, as though bound by a shared understanding. The letters, though faded and worn, revealed fragments of a story that had been hidden for generations. They spoke of a pact made in secrecy, a bond that required loyalty and sacrifice. Eleanor felt a chill as she read, the words weaving a narrative that echoed her own journey, as though her life were a continuation of choices made long ago. She felt the weight of responsibility settle upon her, a sense that she was part of something larger than herself, a legacy that extended beyond wealth or title. The night was deep by the time she returned to her chambers, the box cradled in her arms. She placed it beside the locket on her dressing table, feeling the gravity of her discovery. The items she had found were relics of a story that had shaped her family, yet they were also symbols of the burden she now bore. She had uncovered the shadows of obligation that bound the Sinclairs, a legacy of silent promises and hidden alliances. As she lay in bed, Eleanor felt a mixture of dread and resolve. She knew that her journey was only beginning, that the secrets she had uncovered were but fragments of a larger truth. She felt both haunted and compelled, as though a part of her had been awakened, a part that would not rest until the past was laid bare. She drifted into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with visions of the past, faces she had never known, voices that called to her across time, urging her to uncover the truth. And as the first light of dawn crept through her window, Eleanor awoke with a sense of purpose, a determination that burned within her. She would follow the path her ancestors had laid, guided by the relics of their lives and the whispers of their stories. For the truth, she knew, was not a simple thing. It was a legacy, a testament to the choices made by those who had come before her, and she was prepared to confront it, no matter where it might lead. Chapter 5. The Legacy Unbound. The crisp air of early morning had a peculiar stillness, an almost unnatural quiet that settled over Somerville Manor like a shroud. The house, with all its secrets tucked behind the walls, seemed to breathe in time with Eleanor's growing sense of urgency. The weight of discovery pressed upon her, making her feel that each step, each breath, drew her deeper into a hidden world, a world where her family's past was intertwined with a duty she had yet to understand. Determined, she took the letters and the tarnished locket from her dressing table and tucked them carefully into a leather-bound notebook. Her fingers brushed against the locket's cold surface, its pattern now achingly familiar, as if it were a part of her own skin. She had grown accustomed to carrying it with her, its presence a constant reminder of the legacy she was beginning to uncover. The morning light cast faint shadows on her notebook as she held it, as though the secrets within its pages were restless, eager to be unveiled. With her mind focused on unraveling the mystery, Eleanor found herself drawn to the sprawling gardens, where the boundaries between the estate's meticulously kept grounds and the wild woods beyond seemed to blur. She felt a need to escape the manor's stifling presence, to let the fresh air clear her mind as she pieced together the threads of the past. She walked briskly, the path winding through tall hedges and rows of yew trees that seemed to close around her, cocooning her in silence. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the sharp outlines of bare branches and the rough, twisting roots that anchored them to the earth. Reaching a secluded bench hidden among ivy-covered statues, Eleanor settled herself, spreading her notebook open on her lap. She leafed through the letters with deliberate care, as though each fragile page could crumble at the slightest mishandling. The words on the pages hinted at a solemn bond, a sense of duty that her great-grandfather had carried with him, like a shadow clinging to his every step. Yet, the details were frustratingly vague, concealed by layers of formality and poetic language. Eleanor's heart thudded with impatience, her fingers tracing the lines as if trying to pry the meaning from between the letters. The letters mentioned a promise her great-grandfather had made, a pact that bound his family with that of the mysterious stranger whose presence lingered in Eleanor's life like a ghostly echo. It was as if two lives had merged into one, their fates entwined by circumstances she could only begin to comprehend. She closed her eyes, imagining her ancestor's face, worn with the burden of an unbreakable vow, his every decision dictated by this unspoken obligation. Lost in thought, Eleanor's mind drifted to the man in the photograph, the dark-eyed stranger whose image had stirred something within her. His face was etched with a quiet intensity, a kind of restrained power that hinted at secrets known only to him. The connection between the two men seemed charged with an almost electric energy, as if they had shared a bond that transcended the ordinary, a shared destiny that neither could escape. The day passed slowly as Eleanor pored over every scrap of information she could find, each clue deepening her curiosity yet leaving her with more questions than answers. She discovered references to gatherings held on the grounds of the estate, quiet affairs conducted in the shadow of night, where whispers mingled with the rustling leaves and secrets were passed from one generation to the next. She began to realize that her family's history was not one of simple nobility, but rather a complex tapestry of alliances, promises, and hidden sacrifices that had been concealed beneath a veneer of elegance and decorum. As dusk settled upon the gardens, casting the trees in long, distorted shadows, Eleanor felt a shift within herself. A quiet resolve, a commitment to pursuing the truth even if it meant uncovering uncomfortable realities about her ancestors. She could feel the weight of their decisions bearing down on her, a pressure that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. This legacy was more than just an inheritance of wealth or title. It was a burden she had unknowingly carried from birth, a duty bound to her by blood. Returning to the manor, Eleanor slipped quietly back to her room, the fading light casting an amber glow through the window. The locket, now warm from the day's journey, lay heavy against her chest. She opened the notebook once more, noting the scrawled lines of her own observations, her deductions scribbled hastily alongside the words of her ancestors. She felt as though she were assembling the pieces of a vast puzzle, each fragment revealing only a sliver of the whole. Her thoughts drifted back to her great-grandfather's letters, and an idea began to form within her mind. The language of the letters suggested a duality, an awareness of two lives lived in tandem, each man carrying a part of the other's burden. It was as though her great-grandfather's life had been shadowed by this mysterious bond, an invisible tether that linked his choices to those of his unknown counterpart. Eleanor felt a strange connection to this idea, a sense that her own life had been similarly influenced, shaped by decisions made long before her time. As the last light faded from the sky, Eleanor's gaze fell on the ornate family portrait hanging above the fireplace in her room. The painted faces of her ancestors stared back at her, their eyes seeming to follow her as she moved about the room. She felt a kinship with them, a shared understanding of the burdens they had carried, the sacrifices they had made in the name of duty, and as she gazed upon them, she felt a growing sense of determination, a resolve to uncover the truth of their legacy, no matter how deeply buried it might be. In the quiet of the evening, Eleanor placed the letters, the locket, and her notebook carefully in a drawer, locking them away as though she were safeguarding the very soul of her family. She lay down, her mind alive with thoughts of what lay ahead, the journey she had only just begun. As she drifted into sleep, she dreamed of shadowed paths and silent figures, of a legacy waiting to be unearthed, a truth that called to her from beyond the bounds of time. In the dim haze of morning, Eleanor awoke with the same clarity of purpose that had driven her through the day before. She knew, with an unwavering certainty, that her path was set. She would follow the clues left behind by her great-grandfather, trace the secrets that lay hidden within Somerville Manor's walls, and uncover the true meaning of the legacy she had inherited. For Eleanor, there was no turning back. The legacy unbound awaited her, beckoning her to delve deeper into the shadows, to uncover the truth that had been buried for generations. The journey ahead would not be easy, but she was ready to face whatever trials lay before her, armed with the courage of her ancestors and the resolve of her own heart. Chapter 6: Whispers of the Past. The soft murmur of rain tapped against the tall windows of Somerville Manor, filling the vast halls with a quiet rhythm that seemed to echo Eleanor's own restless heart. She awoke before dawn, her thoughts tangled with the haunting revelations of her family's legacy. The world beyond the window was gray and softened by the morning mist, and as she rose from her bed, Eleanor felt the day stretching out before her like a vast, uncharted landscape. The family records were tucked away in the manor's library, an ancient room filled with towering shelves of leather-bound books and manuscripts dating back centuries. Eleanor had wandered its aisles before, drawn to its worn wooden shelves and the faint scent of old parchment. Yet, today, she felt a sense of purpose she had never felt before, a certainty that within these walls lay the clues to her family's mysterious connection to the shadowed figure from the locket and to her great-grandfather's haunting letters. The rain continued its steady drumming as Eleanor entered the library, her footsteps muted by the plush carpet lining the floor. Light filtered through the rain-speckled windows, casting the room in a silvery glow that danced upon the polished wood. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the rows of neatly arranged volumes. Here, between the covers of these carefully preserved books, lay the history of her ancestors, the story of Somerville Manor, and the secrets it had kept hidden for generations. Her gaze fell upon an old family journal, its spine cracked and fragile with age. She reached for it with reverence, cradling the delicate volume in her hands as she made her way to a nearby reading nook. The journal's pages were filled with faded ink, the words written in an elegant, flowing script. She recognized her great-grandfather's handwriting, and as her eyes traced each line, Eleanor felt as though he were speaking directly to her, his voice reaching out across the years to guide her. The journal entries were filled with accounts of his daily life, of the solemn responsibilities he had upheld as the head of the family. Yet, within these seemingly mundane passages, Eleanor began to discern a deeper layer, a carefully concealed code that hinted at a hidden life he had kept secret even from his closest kin. He spoke of meetings held in secrecy, of letters exchanged under the cover of night, of whispered promises made to a stranger who had come to him seeking refuge. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she read, her mind racing with questions. Who was this stranger, and why had her great-grandfather risked everything to aid him? The entries were vague, filled with cryptic references to a promise he could not break, a duty he was bound to fulfill. Her heart ached with the weight of his words, the anguish of a man torn between loyalty to his family and a mysterious obligation that had haunted him until his final days. She spent hours in the library, her eyes poring over every line, every word. The rain outside grew heavier, the sound filling the room with a steady hum that seemed to lull her into a trance. Page after page revealed fragments of her great-grandfather's secret life, each entry adding another piece to the puzzle that was slowly taking shape in her mind. As she turned the final page of the journal, Eleanor felt a pang of disappointment. The answers she had hoped to find remained elusive, hidden behind the cryptic words and the deliberate vagueness of her ancestors' accounts. Yet, within her heart, she sensed that she was closer to the truth than she had been before, that the secrets of her family were waiting just beyond her reach, ready to be uncovered if she could only find the courage to pursue them. Closing the journal, Eleanor looked up, her gaze falling upon a portrait hanging on the far wall. The painting depicted her great-grandfather, his stern face softened by the light that fell upon him from the nearby window. She studied his expression, the solemn set of his mouth, the quiet intensity in his eyes. It was a face marked by duty, by a life dedicated to the preservation of his family's honor. And yet, there was a glint in his eyes, a flicker of defiance that hinted at the man who had risked everything to protect a stranger, who had carried a secret to his grave. The rain had subsided, leaving the world outside washed clean and still. Eleanor rose from her seat, her mind racing with the possibilities that lay before her. She knew that the path she had chosen would not be easy, that the secrets she sought to uncover would bring her face to face with the ghosts of her family's past. Yet, as she looked around the library, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet resolve that filled her with a strength she had not known she possessed. She left the library, her steps quick and purposeful as she made her way to the manor's west wing. There, beyond the main halls and the grand drawing rooms, lay a part of the house that had been closed off for years, its rooms left untouched since her great-grandfather's time. It was a place steeped in shadows, where the air was thick with the scent of dust and memories. The West Wing had always intrigued Eleanor, its darkened halls calling to her like a siren's song. Yet, she had never dared venture beyond its threshold, held back by an unspoken sense of reverence for the history that lay within. Today, however, was different. Today, she was ready to confront the secrets her family had kept hidden, to face the truth that had eluded her for so long. As she stepped into the corridor, a shiver ran down her spine, the air heavy with a silence that seemed to press upon her from all sides. The walls were lined with portraits of her ancestors, their faces watching her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were walking among ghosts. She moved slowly, her eyes tracing each face, each pair of eyes that seemed to follow her with a silent, knowing gaze. At the end of the corridor, she found herself standing before a large, ornate door, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling as she turned it, the door creaking open to reveal a small, dusty room filled with the relics of a bygone era. There, in the center of the room, stood an old chest, its surface worn and scarred by time. Eleanor knelt beside the chest, her fingers brushing against its rough surface. She could feel the weight of history pressing down upon her, the voices of her ancestors whispering in her ears, urging her to open the chest and uncover the truth that lay within. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid, her heart pounding as she gazed upon the contents within. Inside, she found a collection of documents, letters written in the same elegant hand she had seen in her great-grandfather's journal. There were also photographs, faded images of faces she did not recognize, their expressions marked by the same solemn intensity that had haunted her throughout her journey. And there, beneath the papers, lay a small, silver key, its surface tarnished by years of neglect. Eleanor took the key in her hand, feeling its weight, its cold surface pressing into her palm. She knew, in that moment, that this key was the final piece of the puzzle, the missing link that would unlock the secrets her great-grandfather had carried with him to his grave. Her heart raced as she closed the chest, her mind filled with a sense of anticipation, a feeling that she was on the verge of a discovery that would change her life forever. As she left the room, the key clutched tightly in her hand, Eleanor felt a surge of determination. She had come this far, had risked everything to uncover the truth of her family's legacy. And now, with the key in her possession, she was ready to face whatever lay ahead, to delve deeper into the shadows of the ancestral halls and bring the secrets of her past into the light. Chapter 7. Hidden Beneath the Surface. The dawn broke softly over Somerville Manor, casting pale hues across the sprawling estate. Eleanor rose early, the small, tarnished key resting on her nightstand like a silent invitation. She gazed at it, her mind turning over the possibilities that lay hidden behind the locked doors of her family's past. Today, she would explore the grounds, particularly the garden maze that had always seemed to hold its own mysteries. Wrapping herself in a shawl, Eleanor stepped into the crisp morning air, a fine mist clinging to the dewy grass. The manor loomed behind her, its stone walls towering and somber, a fortress of secrets that had held her family's history within its walls for generations. Her footsteps echoed softly as she crossed the grounds, each step bringing her closer to the garden maze, an intricate labyrinth that had fascinated and unsettled her since she was a child. The maze had been designed by one of her great-great-grandmothers, a woman renowned for her eccentricities and her love for the hidden and obscure. Its hedges were tall and dense, winding in complex patterns that only someone familiar with its design could navigate with ease. As Eleanor stepped inside, she felt a strange sense of reverence, as though entering a sacred space. The air was cooler here, shaded by the high walls of greenery that blocked out the light and muffled the sounds of the outside world. She walked slowly, her fingers brushing against the leaves, feeling the cool, damp texture of the greenery beneath her hand. The path twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the heart of the maze. She could feel the weight of history pressing down upon her, as though her ancestors' footsteps echoed alongside her own. It was as if they, too, had walked these paths, seeking answers to questions that had haunted them as they now haunted her. As she neared the center of the maze, Eleanor's eyes were drawn to a peculiar stone pedestal, overgrown with moss and partially obscured by ivy. Intrigued, she stepped closer, brushing aside the foliage to reveal an intricate carving etched into the surface of the stone. It was a symbol she recognized from her family's coat of arms, a stylized key entwined with vines and roses, the emblem of the Somerville lineage. She traced her fingers over the carving, feeling a strange sense of connection, as though this symbol held the key to unlocking her family's deepest secrets. Suddenly, a faint glint of metal caught her eye, half buried beneath the pedestal's base. She knelt down, her fingers brushing away the dirt and leaves to reveal an old locket, tarnished and worn by time. Its design matched the emblem on the pedestal, and Eleanor felt a surge of excitement as she realized that this locket was no ordinary trinket. It was a relic of her family's past, a fragment of the legacy her ancestors had left behind. She opened the locket, revealing a miniature portrait inside. The face staring back at her was hauntingly familiar, a young woman with a solemn expression and eyes that seemed to gaze directly into Eleanor's soul. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that this woman was the same figure from the faded portrait in the manor's west wing, the same enigmatic presence who had lingered in her dreams and haunted her waking thoughts. Eleanor closed the locket, clutching it tightly as she rose to her feet. The discovery left her feeling exhilarated yet unsettled, as though she had stumbled upon a fragment of a story that was both her own and yet entirely foreign. She felt the weight of the locket pressing into her palm, a tangible reminder of the secrets that lay buried within her family's history. Turning back, she retraced her steps through the maze, her mind racing with questions. She could feel a strange energy pulsing through the air, an almost electric sensation that seemed to grow stronger the closer she came to the edge of the maze. It was as though the very landscape of Somerville Manor was alive, watching her with silent intensity, urging her to delve deeper into the mysteries that lay hidden within its grounds. As she emerged from the maze, Eleanor's gaze was drawn to the distant outline of the family cemetery, a small, secluded plot tucked away at the edge of the estate. The headstones stood in solemn rows, their inscriptions weathered and faded by time, each marking the final resting place of a member of the Somerville lineage. She felt a strange pull, an almost instinctual urge to visit the graves of her ancestors, to seek their guidance as she ventured deeper into the mysteries of her heritage. The path to the cemetery was overgrown, the gravel barely visible beneath the wild tangle of weeds and grass that had claimed it over the years. She moved carefully, her steps slow and deliberate as she made her way towards the cluster of headstones that rose like silent sentinels against the backdrop of the gray sky. The air here was thick with a quiet reverence, a sense of timelessness that seemed to transcend the ordinary boundaries of life and death. Eleanor walked among the graves, her eyes tracing the names etched into the stone, each one a piece of the story that had shaped her family's legacy. She paused before a particularly ancient headstone, its inscription worn almost to illegibility by the passage of time. The name was faint, barely discernible, yet she felt a deep connection to the soul who lay beneath the earth, a kinship that seemed to transcend generations. In that moment, she felt a presence, a gentle yet undeniable sensation that seemed to wrap around her like a warm embrace. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to surrender to the feeling, to let it guide her as she sought the answers that lay hidden within her family's past. She could sense the spirits of her ancestors, their voices whispering softly in the wind, urging her to continue her search, to unlock the secrets that had bound them to this place for centuries. With a renewed sense of purpose, Eleanor turned back toward the manor, the locket clutched tightly in her hand. She could feel the weight of her family's history pressing down upon her, a legacy that she could not escape, no matter how hard she tried. Yet, within her heart, she knew that this was a burden she was willing to bear, that the secrets of her past were worth the sacrifices she would have to make. As she walked, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a quiet acceptance of the path she had chosen. The answers she sought would not come easily, and the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges. But she was ready, her heart filled with a determination that burned brighter with each passing moment. The rain had ceased, leaving the world fresh and silent in its wake, a fitting end to the chapter of discovery she had just begun. Eleanor knew that this was only the beginning, that the secrets she had uncovered were but fragments of a larger puzzle, a mystery that would lead her deeper into the heart of Somerville Manor and the legacy it held. As she crossed the threshold of the manor, the key and the locket heavy in her palm, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was shrouded in shadows, yet she was ready to face whatever lay beyond, to confront the secrets that had bound her family to this place for generations. Chapter 8. Unraveling the Mask. The morning after her visit to the garden maze, Eleanor awoke with a restless energy, the weight of the locket and the key pressing heavily upon her. The discovery had ignited something within her, a spark of curiosity that refused to be extinguished. It was as though the pieces of her family's history were scattered around her like a broken puzzle, and she was the one tasked with putting them back together. Every step she took, every turn she made, felt guided by an invisible hand, urging her toward a truth she could barely comprehend. She knew she could no longer ignore the growing pull toward the manor's hidden rooms, the ones locked away behind doors that had never been opened, rooms that held the secrets of those who had come before her. The key she held was no ordinary object. It was the key to unraveling the mystery that had haunted her family for generations. In the hours that followed, Eleanor quietly made her way through the long, dimly lit corridors of Somerville Manor, her steps measured and purposeful. The air inside the manor was heavy with dust and the faint scent of aged wood, a musty reminder of the years that had passed. The walls seemed to close in around her, as if the very stones were watching, listening, awaiting her next move. Her first stop was the library, a cavernous room filled with shelves upon shelves of books that chronicled the long history of the Somerville family. She had spent countless hours here as a child, perusing the old tomes, absorbing tales of her ancestors' exploits and tragedies. But today, the library held a different purpose for her. She was no longer seeking stories of the past for entertainment. She was searching for the key to unlocking the mystery that had been hidden away for so long. She moved with quiet determination, her fingers grazing the spines of books as she walked between the rows of shelves. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the titles with a practiced gaze, until one book in particular caught her attention. It was an old, leather-bound volume, its cover worn with age. The title, embossed in gold leaf, read, "The Chronicles of the Somerville Lineage." She had seen it before, but had never felt compelled to open it. Today, however, something about it seemed to call to her. She pulled the book from the shelf, brushing the dust from its surface before carefully flipping it open. The pages were yellowed with age, their edges curling slightly, yet the writing inside was remarkably legible. The book chronicled the early history of the Somerville family, tracing its roots back to the first generation to settle in the estate. But it was not the early history that caught Eleanor's eye. It was a series of entries written in the margins of the pages, small annotations that seemed to have been added long after the original text had been composed. The handwriting was elegant, almost too perfect, but there was an urgency to it that suggested the writer had been racing against time. As Eleanor read, the words began to form a story, a secret long buried, but now brought to the surface once more. The entries spoke of a hidden room, one that had been sealed off from the rest of the manor and kept from the knowledge of the family. This room, the writer claimed, held the answers to a long-standing mystery, a mystery that had been guarded for generations. The more Eleanor read, the more her heart quickened. This hidden room was no mere curiosity. It was the key to understanding her family's legacy, and perhaps even her own. The writer had left clues, carefully tucked away within the pages of the book, each one pointing toward the location of the room and the means by which it could be accessed. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the final entry, which pointed toward a forgotten corner of the manor, a room hidden behind a false wall in the west wing. Her pulse quickened as she closed the book, the weight of the discovery settling over her like a cloak. She had to go there, to the west wing, to uncover the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. The key in her pocket seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if urging her to act before the opportunity slipped away. Without another thought, Eleanor left the library, the book clutched tightly in her hand. She made her way through the winding hallways, past the grand staircase and the numerous rooms that filled the manor, until she reached the west wing. The air here was colder, the hallways narrower, and the sense of secrecy was palpable, as though the very walls themselves were reluctant to reveal their hidden truths. She stopped in front of a door that seemed indistinguishable from the others, its frame old but sturdy. Her heart pounded in her chest as she drew the key from her pocket and inserted it into the lock. The key turned smoothly, its mechanism clicking into place with an almost imperceptible sound. With a steady hand, Eleanor pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest as if reluctant to be disturbed after so many years of silence. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in a layer of cobwebs that had been untouched for years. But despite its neglected appearance, The room held a strange, almost magnetic pull. Eleanor stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of what might be hidden there. The walls were lined with shelves, but there were no books here, only old crates and boxes, some of which appeared to have been sealed shut long ago. It was the far wall that caught her attention. There, hidden behind a faded tapestry, was a narrow door, its surface smooth and unadorned. She had no doubt that this was the hidden room the book had described. She approached it slowly, her breath shallow with anticipation. As her fingers brushed against the door, she felt a strange jolt of energy, as though something ancient and powerful was waiting for her to unlock its secrets. With trembling hands, she placed her palm against the door and pushed. It resisted at first, but with a gentle nudge, it gave way, creaking open to reveal a narrow passageway that led deeper into the manor. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, the door closing softly behind her. The darkness ahead was oppressive, but she knew she had to press forward. There was no turning back now. As she moved deeper into the passage, the air grew colder, and the silence around her seemed to grow heavier, pressing down upon her like a tangible force. She could feel the weight of her family's history pressing on her shoulders, each step bringing her closer to the answers she had longed for. At the end of the passage, the faintest light filtered through a crack in the stone, revealing a small, hidden chamber. It was empty save for a pedestal at its center, upon which rested an old, wooden box. The box was intricately carved, its surface covered in delicate symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Eleanor approached it cautiously, her hands trembling as she reached for it. The moment her fingers made contact with the box, she felt a surge of energy, powerful, ancient, and undeniable. She lifted the box carefully, feeling the weight of its contents pressing against her palms. Whatever lay inside, it was something her family had guarded for generations, something that could change everything she knew about her past. As she opened the box, the faintest glint of gold caught her eye, and Eleanor knew that she was about to discover the truth that had eluded her for so long. Chapter 9. A Test of Trust. Eleanor stood frozen in the dim light of the hidden chamber, the box resting in her hands, its contents cloaked in shadows. Her breath came in shallow, measured gasps as the weight of the moment settled upon her. The very air seemed to thrum with an energy she could not explain, a presence that seemed to be watching, waiting for her to make the next move. The stone walls of the chamber felt oppressive, as though they were closing in on her, bearing down with the pressure of the secrets they had held for so many years. For a long moment, Eleanor did not move. She simply stared at the box, her fingers curled around its edges, hesitant to open it fully. She had come this far, but the enormity of what lay before her filled her with both awe and trepidation. Was she truly ready to confront whatever truth had been concealed inside? Could she bear to learn the legacy that her family had fought so hard to keep hidden? The dim flicker of torchlight from the far corner of the chamber cast long, wavering shadows across the walls, distorting the shapes and creating a sense of foreboding. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing in time with her, sensing her uncertainty. She could feel the pulse of something ancient and powerful beneath her fingers, the key to something long lost to history. Her mind swirled with questions, each one more pressing than the last. What had led her family to hide this box? What was inside it that had been deemed so dangerous, so valuable, that it warranted secrecy for generations? She had a sense that whatever lay within it would change everything, about herself, about her family, and perhaps even about the very nature of the world she had always known. The room seemed to hold its breath as Eleanor carefully lifted the lid of the box. It opened with a soft creak, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled within a bed of dark velvet, was a small, ornate key. It was unlike any key she had ever seen before. its surface polished and glinting in the dim light, adorned with intricate carvings of swirling vines and arcane symbols. The key seemed to hum with a strange energy, as though it were alive, imbued with a purpose beyond her understanding. As her fingers closed around the key, a sudden surge of realization washed over her. This was the key to the hidden room in Somerville Manor, the one described in the journal of her ancestor. The key that would unlock not just a physical space, but the mysteries of her family's past. The key to understanding her own place within the intricate web of history. But there was more. Beneath the key, there was a piece of parchment, folded with care and yellowed with age. Eleanor carefully unfolded it, her heart racing as she began to read the words written in delicate, flowing script. The writing was faint, almost indecipherable in places, but the message was clear enough: a warning, a cautionary tale, passed down through generations. The parchment spoke of a betrayal, a secret that had torn apart the Somerville family, a secret so dangerous that it had been buried for generations, hidden from prying eyes. The words described a pact made long ago, one that bound the fates of Eleanor's ancestors to something far darker than she had ever imagined. The key, it seemed, was not just a symbol of power. It was a symbol of accountability, of responsibility for a choice that had been made long before her time. As Eleanor read, a shiver ran down her spine. The more she understood, the more she realized that the mystery of the hidden room was not just about uncovering a family secret. It was about confronting the consequences of actions taken by those who had come before her, actions that had shaped the very world she inhabited. The weight of their decisions now rested on her shoulders. The words on the parchment grew increasingly urgent, warning of a shadow that had followed the Somerville family for centuries, a shadow that still lingered, waiting to emerge from the depths of the past. It was a warning of something dark and powerful, something that had been sealed away long ago, but was now stirring, ready to make its return. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she absorbed the gravity of the situation. The legacy she had inherited was not one of honor and pride, as she had once believed. It was one of duty and fear. Her gaze shifted back to the ornate key in her hand. She felt the weight of its significance more acutely now, as though it were not just a physical object, but a burden that would forever alter the course of her life. She could no longer deny that her fate had been entwined with the fate of the Somerville family long before she had ever set foot in this manor. She was not just a passive observer of history. She was a part of it, bound by blood and by a secret that had been passed down through the generations. The thought filled her with a sense of foreboding. What had she stumbled upon? What was she supposed to do with the knowledge she had uncovered? The answers were elusive, shrouded in mystery, but one thing was certain. Eleanor could not turn back. There was no escaping the legacy of her family. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but she had no choice but to follow it, to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. As she slowly rose to her feet, her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, barely audible over the rush of her own heartbeat. A creak, followed by the soft rustle of fabric as though someone, or something, was moving in the shadows. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively gripped the key tighter in her hand, her gaze darting to the corners of the chamber. The air seemed to grow colder, and the faint flicker of torchlight cast dancing shadows across the walls. She was no longer alone. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before taking a step toward the source of the sound. Her breath hitched as she felt an overwhelming presence, one that was both familiar and unsettling. It was as though the room itself had become an extension of her thoughts, responding to the turmoil that swirled within her mind. The walls seemed to close in around her, the darkness thickening. The key in her hand pulsed again, as if urging her to make a decision, to move forward. But in that moment, she understood that the key was not just the means of unlocking the manor's secrets. It was also the key to unlocking the shadows that lingered just beyond her reach, the shadows that had waited patiently for her to uncover the past. With a deep breath, Eleanor turned toward the passage that led deeper into the manor, the key held firmly in her grasp. She was ready to face whatever lay ahead, to confront the legacy that had shaped her, and to learn the truth of what her ancestors had done. The journey had only just begun. Chapter 10. Between Duty and Desire. The night had fallen over Somerville Manor with an oppressive weight. The skies were thick with clouds, the moon obscured, and the wind carried with it the scent of damp earth and ancient stone. Eleanor moved through the vast hallways of the manor as though in a dream, each step echoing in the silence that surrounded her. The house seemed to breathe with her, its walls creaking and shifting, responding to the secrets that had been unearthed. With the key in her hand, the weight of her discovery pressed upon her, the world outside the manor forgotten. She had opened the box. She had uncovered the past, and yet the answers eluded her, swirling just out of reach. The shadows of her ancestors seemed to stretch toward her, guiding her, or perhaps watching, judging her every move. Every corner of the manor felt alive with their presence. The chamber she had uncovered, the one where the key had been hidden, felt far removed from the rest of the house. The air was thick, heavy with the centuries of history that had been contained within its walls. But it was not just the history that clung to the room. It was something darker, something unspoken. Eleanor could feel it now, pulsing just beneath the surface of the manor's aged timbers. As she moved further into the manor, she found herself drawn once more to the hidden passage she had uncovered in the journal. The one described by her ancestor, the one that led deeper into the heart of Somerville Manor. The key still felt warm in her palm, its surface glinting faintly in the dim light, as though it too had a purpose beyond her understanding. She approached the hidden door slowly, the air thickening with tension. The corridor beyond was narrow and dark, a stark contrast to the grand hallways of the manor. The walls here were damp, the stone cool to the touch, and the faint scent of earth and decay seemed to seep from every crack. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she stepped into the passage, feeling the weight of history press in on all sides. The space was tight, the darkness swallowing her up as she ventured further in, the flickering light of the torches behind her fading. The deeper she moved, the more oppressive the air became. It was as though the very passage itself was a living thing, a creature that had been waiting for her arrival. The sense of something ancient, something older than the manor itself, grew stronger with each step. Eleanor's heart raced, but her resolve did not falter. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The corridor finally opened into a vast chamber, its walls lined with stone and covered in a thick layer of dust. A single beam of light from a crack in the ceiling illuminated the center of the room, where a large stone pedestal stood, ancient and worn. The room was completely still, save for the faint rustling of the air, as if something had shifted after centuries of silence. At the center of the pedestal, just within the shaft of light, lay a large tome, its cover intricately decorated with symbols that mirrored those on the key. The book was old, its pages yellowed and fragile, but the aura around it was unmistakable. It was the heart of the mystery, the missing piece of the puzzle that had eluded her for so long. Eleanor moved toward the pedestal, her footsteps soft against the stone floor. As she reached out for the book, a coldness washed over her, and the air seemed to grow even heavier. She could feel the weight of the past pressing upon her, the presence of those who had come before her, ancestors and strangers alike, watching from the shadows, waiting for her to uncover their secrets. She hesitated for only a moment before lifting the book from its resting place. The moment her fingers brushed against its cover, a strange shiver ran through her, as though the very act of touching the book had awakened something deep within the manor. The room seemed to shift, and for a fleeting moment, Eleanor felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, the past reaching out to engulf her. But she held firm, clutching the book tightly to her chest. She had come too far to turn back now. The answers were here, hidden within these ancient pages, and they would be hers to uncover. She could feel the pulse of destiny in her veins, a force greater than herself driving her forward. With the book in hand, Eleanor turned to leave the chamber, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the passage. The manor seemed to hold its breath, as though the walls were waiting for the story to continue, for the next chapter to unfold. And as she retraced her steps through the dark corridor, she knew that she had crossed a line, that the past was no longer a distant memory, but an inescapable presence. As she stepped back into the grand hall, the torchlight flickering as she passed, the sense of unease grew stronger. The house felt different now, as though the weight of its secrets had shifted, the balance between the present and the past irrevocably altered. The manor, once a place of refuge, now seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of danger, as if the very walls were whispering of things long buried, things best left forgotten. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the book, the ornate key still tucked safely within her pocket. The mystery had deepened, and the shadows seemed to grow longer with each passing moment. What had begun as a search for answers was quickly becoming a journey into something far more dangerous. But Eleanor was no longer afraid. She had glimpsed the truth, and it was far more complicated and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The past, it seemed, had not finished with her yet. Chapter 11. The Game of Pretenses. The next morning, the manor appeared unchanged, unmoved by the events of the previous night, as though time itself had taken a pause in the wake of Eleanor's discovery. The air outside was crisp, the sky a pale shade of gray, and a faint mist clung to the ground like a secret that had yet to be revealed. The usual bustle of the household seemed distant, muted, as though the manor had grown accustomed to the quiet it had once enjoyed. But for Eleanor, there was no escaping the weight that pressed down upon her. The book lay heavy on her desk, its leather cover still warm from her touch the night before. She had not dared to open it fully yet. The feeling of something ancient and powerful lingering in the room kept her from reading further, but she could not ignore the pull it exerted on her. It called to her, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind, urging her to learn the truth that had been kept from her for so long. But each time she reached for it, something held her back. It was as though she were afraid to know what lay within, afraid to confront the depths of the family's secrets. Eleanor moved away from the desk, her fingers brushing lightly over the surface of the book as she passed. The house was still, the servants going about their work in silence, and the grand hallways of Somerville Manor felt more like a labyrinth than a home. She was beginning to realize just how little she knew of the place, despite having spent her entire life within its walls. There were hidden rooms, secret passageways, and hidden histories that she had never even guessed at. The manor was a living entity, one that had endured for centuries, and now she had become a part of its legacy. But as much as she tried to push her thoughts away, they came rushing back, images of the past that seemed to swirl within the walls, flickering like the shadows cast by the candlelight. The key, the book, the warning in the letter, all of it seemed to be pulling her deeper into a web of mystery, a web spun long before her birth. Her connection to the manor and to her ancestors was no longer just a matter of blood. It was a matter of fate. As the day wore on, Eleanor found herself walking the corridors of the manor, her mind preoccupied with the ancient tome she had discovered. The house had an eerie stillness about it now, as though the air itself had become thick with anticipation. Each room seemed unchanged, yet there was something different about the way the walls seemed to press inward, as though they were closing in on her. She moved slowly, almost as if afraid of disturbing the stillness, but every step she took seemed to lead her further into the unknown. The portrait of her great-grandfather, a stern figure with cold, piercing eyes, seemed to follow her wherever she went. It had always hung in the grand foyer, its presence a constant reminder of the family's past, but now it felt less like a mere piece of art and more like a silent observer. The eyes of the portrait seemed to shift, to focus on her as if waiting for something. Eleanor's skin prickled as she passed by it, as though she could feel his gaze burning into her back. It was not just the manor that felt different now. The world outside had changed as well. The trees that had once stood tall and proud against the landscape now seemed to bow their heads, their branches heavy with the weight of the secrets they held. The sky was darker, the clouds more ominous, and the wind whispered through the leaves like a forgotten memory. Eleanor could not shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for her to make a move. The stillness of the manor seemed to wrap around her like a cloak, muffling the sounds of her footsteps and the beating of her heart. It was as though the house itself had become aware of her presence, as though it had been waiting for her to return and finish the story that had been left unfinished for so many years. The walls had absorbed the weight of countless generations, each one leaving behind their own mark, their own secrets. And now, Eleanor was part of that history, whether she was ready for it or not. She stopped before the grand staircase, staring at the worn steps that led to the upper floors. There was a door at the top of the stairs, one that had always been locked, the key long since lost. Her father had often spoken of it in hushed tones, but never in detail. It was a door that no one dared to open, a door that had been sealed away for a reason. Now, standing at the base of the stairs, Eleanor felt the pull of it more strongly than ever before. She could not ignore it any longer. There was a part of her that longed to open that door, to see what lay beyond it. But there was another part of her that feared what she might find. Her hand hovered over the banister as she climbed the stairs, each step a deliberate move toward the unknown. The air seemed heavier the higher she climbed, the weight of the past pressing down on her with every footstep. The silence of the manor stretched on, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the faint rustling of the wind outside. Eleanor reached the top of the stairs and paused, her eyes fixed on the door at the end of the hall. The door was as she had remembered it, solid, unyielding, and locked. But now, standing before it, Eleanor felt a strange sense of inevitability. The past was calling her, urging her to face it, to confront the truths that had been hidden for so long. The key to the manor's deepest secrets was within her reach, and it was time to unlock it. She turned away from the door and made her way back down the staircase. The house seemed to exhale a sigh, as though it had been holding its breath, waiting for her to take the next step. And when she reached the bottom of the stairs, Eleanor knew, deep within her, that there was no turning back. The path ahead was clear, and she would follow it, no matter where it led. Chapter 12. The Echo of Forbidden Words. The days that followed were marked by an unsettling quiet. Eleanor could no longer ignore the pull of the manor, nor the overwhelming weight of the secrets it concealed. Every room she entered seemed to watch her, the silence pressing in around her like the slow, inevitable turn of time. Even the air seemed thicker now, laden with the sense that something was shifting in the shadows, something waiting for her to act. She had spent the previous night alone in her chamber, the ancient tome lying open before her, the strange symbols within its pages beginning to make sense, but only in fragments. The language of her ancestors was foreign to her, yet there was something instinctual in the way the words seemed to call out, as though they were meant for her to decipher. She could not turn away, despite the unease that clung to her like a second skin. She could feel the past stretching out before her, its tendrils reaching forward to entwine her. And yet, she could not bring herself to fully absorb what she read. The book contained more than just history. It was a ledger of secrets, of power, of loss, of hidden lives lived within these very walls. Eleanor had learned of an underground network, hidden for centuries, one that tied the Somerville family to forces beyond mere inheritance or social standing. There were whispers of ancient rites, forgotten alliances, and promises made under moonlit skies. She had always thought her family's legacy was built on tradition and nobility, but what she now discovered painted a far darker picture, one of forbidden pacts and the weight of generations that had lived in shadows. Despite her growing unease, Eleanor knew that the answers were closer than she thought. The manor itself seemed to call to her, urging her to uncover its deepest, most hidden corners. The locked door at the top of the stairs had been gnawing at her for days, its presence looming in her mind like an unsolved riddle. And though her heart raced each time she passed it, she knew she could not leave it closed forever. Eleanor moved with purpose through the corridors of Somerville Manor, her mind fully consumed by the mysteries that had become her reality. The manor had become a labyrinth of sorts, each turn revealing something new. There were no longer safe places, no room untouched by the weight of what she had learned. Her thoughts constantly turned back to the book and to the strange sensation she had felt upon touching its pages. There was something insidious about the way the words seemed to seep into her mind, as if they were altering the very fabric of her thoughts. Her grip on the present moment was slipping, and she could feel herself falling deeper into the web that had been spun around her. As the days passed, she found herself wandering not just through the familiar halls of the manor, but into the parts of the house she had never dared to enter before. The eastern wing was the most neglected, filled with dust and forgotten remnants of a bygone era. There were rooms there that no one ever spoke of, rooms that had been closed off long before Eleanor had been born. The air there was thick, musty with age, and yet there was something oddly inviting about the stillness of that part of the house. It was as if the forgotten wing held the last of the truth she sought, hidden away from the prying eyes of the world. One particular room caught her attention, a small, dimly lit space at the end of a narrow hallway. It was hidden behind a set of wooden doors, the kind that had not been opened in decades, their hinges stiff with disuse. The room was silent as she entered, the faint scent of old leather and paper lingering in the air. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and artifacts that had long been abandoned, their contents concealed beneath layers of dust. It was in this room, amidst the relics of forgotten history, that Eleanor found what she was looking for. On a shelf near the back of the room, half hidden beneath a pile of old maps and journals, lay a small wooden chest. It was nondescript, unremarkable in every way, except for the way it seemed to pulse with energy, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she reached for it, the sensation of recognition flooding her. It was as though the chest had been meant for her, as if it had always belonged to her. The latch clicked open with a soft, almost hesitant sound, and inside, nestled among the worn cloth and old papers, was another key, a key that matched the one she had discovered earlier. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it from the chest. It was identical to the first, but there was something different about it, something that set it apart. The metal was colder, its edges sharper, and the intricate symbols carved into its surface were more elaborate, more detailed than the first. As she held it, Eleanor felt a surge of power, an ancient, almost primal force that seemed to pulse through the key, as though it was calling her to unlock something much more significant than the manor's walls. She could feel its weight in her very bones, the key a part of her as much as it was a part of the family legacy that had been hidden for so long. Eleanor closed the chest carefully, as though not wishing to disturb the delicate balance that had been set in motion. She stood there for a long moment, holding the second key in her hand, its significance weighing heavily upon her. She had thought she was close to uncovering the truth. But this was something else entirely. The key was not just a piece of her family's past. It was a piece of something far more dangerous, something that had been buried for a reason. The air in the room grew thick with the weight of her discovery. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with an unearthly force. The sky darkened, and the manor seemed to shift in response to the change in atmosphere, the walls groaning as if they were alive. Eleanor's thoughts raced, but the more she thought about it, the less certain she became. The truth was within her reach, but it was no longer the simple family mystery she had once believed it to be. The keys, the book, the hidden doors, they were all part of a far more complicated and dangerous puzzle. Her hand tightened around the key, the metal biting into her skin, and she knew that there was no turning back. The manor's secret was no longer just a story. It was real. And Eleanor, whether she was ready or not, was now a part of it. Chapter 13. The Choice Unspoken. The days that followed felt as though the world had slowed to a standstill. Eleanor could no longer deny the weight of the secret she was carrying. The manor, with all its history and all its mysteries, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Every corner of the house had become a reflection of her thoughts, silent, oppressive, and full of unanswered questions. She had returned to her chamber after finding the second key, the metal still heavy in her hand, and had spent hours there, studying the intricate symbols and the strange aura that clung to the relic. The more she examined it, the more she realized that she had been mistaken to think she could control the story. There were no simple answers, no easy paths through the tangled web of her family's past. She was not just a witness to the legacy. She was being pulled into it, bound by an invisible force. The room seemed to close in around her as she sat there in silence, the air thick with the weight of what she knew. It wasn't just the keys that had changed everything. It was the discovery that the Somerville family's wealth and power were not merely a product of their noble status. There were hidden threads, far darker and more complicated than she had ever imagined, stretching back centuries, and her family's history was tied to forces that she had once thought to be mere myths. The symbols in the book, the strange rituals, the whispered legends, all of it pointed to a greater truth that had been buried beneath the foundations of the manor, forgotten by all except those who had hidden it away. Eleanor's fingers traced the edges of the key, its cold metal feeling more like a burden than an artifact. The secrets of the manor were no longer confined to books or forgotten rooms. They were alive, pulsing beneath the floorboards, beneath the walls. It was as if the very structure of the house had been built to conceal the truth, to lock it away from prying eyes, and Eleanor had unwittingly unlocked a door that had been meant to remain shut forever. She knew what she had to do. The room at the top of the stairs, the one she had walked past so many times without giving it a second thought, was calling to her. The locked door, the one that had seemed like nothing more than an architectural curiosity, was now the key to everything. She had sensed it the moment she had touched the second key. There was no denying the connection. It was as if the door had been waiting for her to find the answers it held. The air outside had turned cold, the wind howling against the windows as though echoing the turmoil inside her. Eleanor stood up, her body moving on its own accord, as if something greater than her will was guiding her steps. She could not ignore the pull any longer. She had been standing still for too long, and now it was time to move. The manor was no longer just her home. It was a part of her, and she could no longer pretend she could escape it. She left her chamber, the corridors stretching before her like an endless maze, and made her way toward the eastern wing. The silence of the house seemed to follow her, wrapping around her like a cloak. Every footstep was a reminder that she was no longer alone in the house, that the secrets of the Somerville family were as alive as she was. She could feel the weight of them pressing in on her, could hear the whisper of their ghosts in the stillness. The eastern wing was darker now, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped behind the horizon. The room where the chest had been hidden, the one where she had found the second key, was now a place of strange significance. Eleanor paused in front of the wooden door that led to the staircase, her hand hovering over the handle as though unsure whether she should proceed. But there was no going back. She had come too far to turn away now. The air in the hallway was thick, filled with an unspoken tension that seemed to vibrate with energy. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she reached for the door. She turned the handle, the sound of the lock releasing a sharp, echoing note in the stillness. The door opened with a soft creak, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor stepped into the unknown. The staircase that awaited her was narrow and winding, the walls covered in faded tapestries that seemed to tell stories of a long-forgotten past. As she ascended, the air grew colder, the scent of old wood and dust mingling with something else, something faint but undeniably present. It was a smell that lingered in the back of her mind, one that reminded her of the tombs she had read about in ancient texts, places where secrets were buried away, not to be disturbed. At the top of the stairs, she paused before another door. This one different from the others. It was smaller, more modest, yet there was something about it that made it stand out. The key she had discovered fit perfectly into the lock, and with a twist, the door opened. Inside, the room was a strange sight. It was not the sterile emptiness she had expected, but rather a place of quiet reverence. The walls were lined with shelves upon shelves of ancient objects, relics, paintings, and items she could not name. It was as though the room had been preserved for centuries, untouched by time or the hands of men. In the center of the room stood an altar, a stone pedestal that was covered in a layer of dust, yet its surface gleamed with an unnatural light. On the pedestal lay an object, carefully wrapped in a cloth, as though it had been waiting for her. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart pounding as she approached it. There was a strange energy in the air, a force that seemed to draw her closer to the altar. Her hands shook as she unwrapped the cloth, revealing a crystal orb, its surface smooth and gleaming, as though it had been crafted by some unknown force. The orb was unlike anything she had ever seen, and yet it felt familiar, as though it had always belonged to her. As her fingers brushed against the orb, a rush of memories surged through her. Visions of a time long past, of lives lived and lost, of secrets buried deep within the earth. It was as if the orb held the collective memories of her ancestors, the knowledge of everything that had come before. Eleanor closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of the past that seemed to press upon her. The orb pulsed with energy in her hands, and she realized, with a sudden clarity, that she had crossed the point of no return. The truth was within her grasp, but it came at a price. There was no escaping the legacy of her family now. There was no turning back. The orb in her hands grew warmer, and the room seemed to close in around her. The walls were no longer silent. They were alive with whispers, with the weight of history that had been waiting for her to uncover. She had unlocked the door, and now she would face the truth, whatever it was. Chapter 14. Crossing the line of tradition. The dawn broke slowly over the horizon, casting a pale light across the manor as Eleanor stood still, staring at the crystal orb in her hands. It had not taken long for the world around her to shift. As the orb pulsed with an unearthly energy, the sense of isolation she had once felt in the house was replaced with an overwhelming presence, a presence that seemed to fill the very air, surrounding her like an invisible force. It was as if the orb was calling her, as though it were the final piece of a puzzle that had been centuries in the making. Eleanor had never truly understood the weight of her family's legacy, but now it seemed to bear down upon her with the force of 1,000 generations. She could feel it in her bones, a presence that had been hidden beneath the surface of everyday life, a secret that had always been there but had never been seen. Now, as she stood in that room, surrounded by relics and symbols of a past she could scarcely comprehend, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. The truth was not something that could be controlled or contained. It was something that must be confronted, no matter the cost. Her fingers tightened around the orb, and a strange sensation washed over her. Rush of images, feelings, and memories that seemed to belong not to her, but to others. Faces from the past flashed before her eyes. Figures she did not recognize, yet somehow she felt connected to them. There was a sense of urgency, a feeling that she had been chosen to carry a burden that had been passed down through the ages. The orb was not simply an object of power. It was a key, and it was unlocking something deeper within her, something that had lain dormant until now. The air in the room grew heavier, the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders. It was no longer just the history of the Somerville family that she was uncovering. It was the history of the land itself, the history of the very house she stood in. The manor had been built upon ancient foundations, and those foundations had been built upon even older secrets. Eleanor had once believed that the manor was merely a place of inheritance, a symbol of her family's wealth and status. But now she saw it for what it truly was, a living, breathing monument to a forgotten age, a place where the past had been buried, hidden away beneath layers of stone and brick. Her mind reeled with the enormity of it all. What had she uncovered? What was the purpose of the orb? She felt as though she were standing on the edge of something vast, something incomprehensible, and yet she could not bring herself to turn away. She had already come too far. The room around her seemed to shift and change as though the very walls were alive. The shelves of ancient books and relics began to glow faintly, their contents suddenly seeming to move and twist. It was as though the objects themselves were whispering to her, urging her to understand. Eleanor's mind struggled to make sense of the images that flashed before her eyes. Stories of distant ancestors, of rituals performed in secret, of pacts made with forces beyond human comprehension. There were shadows in the corners of her vision, dark figures that watched her from the edges of time. For a moment, she could feel the presence of those long gone. Her ancestors, the men and women who had built this house and shaped her family's destiny. They were there with her, their spirits woven into the fabric of the house, their choices and actions echoing down through the centuries. It was as though their very essence was locked within the walls, bound to the manor. And now that she had uncovered the secret, she too had become a part of it. The orb's glow grew brighter, its light filling the room and casting strange shadows on the walls. Eleanor could no longer tell where the past ended and the present began. It was as though time had lost its meaning, its boundaries blurred by the force of the orb's energy. The air crackled with power, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor felt the true weight of the legacy she had inherited. It was not a legacy of wealth or status, but of power. A power that had been passed down through the generations, waiting for someone to take it up. She could feel the weight of the decision before her. What would she do with the knowledge she had uncovered? The orb had shown her glimpses of the past, but it had also revealed something far more dangerous, the truth of her own place in it all. Eleanor was no longer just a passive observer. She was an active participant in the drama that had unfolded long before she had been born. She could no longer remain in the safety of ignorance. The time for questions had passed. Now, she had to face the consequences of the choices made by those who had come before her. The silence in the room was deafening as she stood there, the orb still pulsing in her hands. She could hear the echoes of her ancestors in the silence, whispers of those who had made their own decisions, their own sacrifices. They had faced the same choices she now faced. And though their paths had been different, their destination had been the same. A reckoning with the past. Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing heart. She knew what she had to do. She had to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The manor was not just a home. It was a battleground, a place where the forces of the past and present collided. And now that she had uncovered its secrets, she had no choice but to confront what lay within its walls. As she opened her eyes, the room seemed to blur, the world around her fading into a haze of light and shadow. The orb in her hands pulsed once more, its glow intensifying, and for a moment, Eleanor felt herself falling. She reached out instinctively, grasping at the walls of the room, but there was nothing to hold on to. The ground beneath her seemed to vanish, and she was left suspended in a strange, timeless space. She had crossed the threshold, and now there was no turning back. Chapter 15. Bound by an unwritten promise. The manor stood as it always had, cloaked in the dim light of the early morning. The house had become both a sanctuary and a prison to Eleanor. She could feel the weight of her discovery pressing against her chest, as though her heart was tethered to the very foundations of the house itself. The secret she had uncovered, the ancient force that had existed for centuries beneath the layers of stone and family history, no longer seemed distant. It was now a part of her, a heavy truth she could not unlearn, and one that she could not share. Eleanor had spent the night wandering through the grand halls, the orb still clutched tightly in her hand. Each step felt like a step through time itself. The ornate mirrors on the walls seemed to shift with her movements, their reflections no longer just her own, but those of figures long forgotten. The faces of her ancestors flashed before her eyes once more, their expressions filled with silent judgments, as though they too were waiting for her to make her choice. The history of the Somerville family was intertwined with her own, each decision made by those before her now echoing in the present. The truth had unraveled itself in a way she hadn't expected. The orb, though powerful, was not a mere object of power. It was a key to understanding the past, to unlocking the deepest parts of the manor's legacy. But its glow had also revealed something darker, something hidden even from the very people who had built this place. Eleanor had learned of the ancient pact, the blood oath made by her forebears to protect something much greater than wealth or land. A force that had once been controlled by her ancestors, but which had now grown too strong to be kept bound within the walls of the manor. It had begun to seep into the present, and with it, Eleanor knew, came the threat of something far more dangerous than mere tradition. The weight of this knowledge had altered her in ways she hadn't expected. It was not just the pressure of her family's history that weighed on her, but the awareness that the world she had known was a fragile construct built upon lies and omissions. She could feel the tension in the air now, as though everything around her, the house, the land, the very world, was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. There was no turning back. The decision was no longer hers to make alone. The orb had been passed to her, and its power now coursed through her veins, its essence tied to hers in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. But one thing was certain. It was not something that could be ignored or buried. The orb was not a gift, but a curse. As she stood before the grand windows, looking out over the sprawling estate, the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the mist. The landscape before her seemed to stretch on forever, the trees and the hills covered in a shroud of fog, as though nature itself was hiding something. Her mind wandered back to the days before she had uncovered the truth, before she had learned what her family had truly done. In those days, she had lived in ignorance, content to follow the path that had been laid before her. But now, that path was no longer clear. She was no longer the naive daughter of a powerful family, content with the world as it was. The truth had changed her. She walked through the halls once more. But this time the manor felt different. Each step she took seemed to reverberate in her chest, the echo of her movements unsettling in the silence. She could feel the eyes of the house upon her, the very walls seeming to watch her every move. The manor had always been a place of mystery, but now it felt alive, its history woven into every crack in the walls, every shadow in the corners. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Her footsteps led her to the library, a room that had always offered her solace in the past. The shelves, lined with leather-bound books, now appeared to be filled with secrets she could no longer ignore. The ancient tomes seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as though they too were aware of her newfound knowledge. She reached for one, her fingers brushing the cool surface of the spine, but as she did, a strange sensation washed over her. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening in the corners. She quickly withdrew her hand, feeling a sudden unease that she could not explain. Eleanor stepped back, her heart racing as she turned away from the shelves. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage. The truth she had uncovered had trapped her within its walls, and there was no escape. She had known that her family had kept secrets, but she had never understood the true extent of their influence. The weight of the pact, the promises made long ago, had bound her to this place, to this legacy. And now, the consequences of that pact were beginning to unfold. The sound of footsteps reached her ears, and Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She was not alone, but as she turned, she found herself staring at the empty hall. No one was there. Yet, she could feel the presence of someone, something, in the air around her. The house had always been quiet, but now the silence was oppressive. It was as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for her to make her next move. Her thoughts were interrupted by a low, distant rumble, one that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The manor trembled for a moment, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as though the very foundation of the house was shifting. It was then that she understood. The house, the land, and everything she had known were not just connected to the past. They were part of something far larger, something far more dangerous. The orb pulsed again, its light growing brighter in her hand, and Eleanor knew that it was time. She could no longer hide from the truth, nor could she deny her place within it. The time had come to face what lay ahead, to confront the forces that had been set in motion centuries ago. The legacy of the Somerville family was no longer a mere shadow. It was a living force, and Eleanor was its chosen heir. As the tremors continued, growing in intensity, Eleanor made her decision. She would not allow the past to consume her, nor would she allow the secrets of her family to dictate her future. The orb's power was hers to wield, and she would not shy away from the responsibility that came with it. The house might tremble, and the earth might shift, but she would stand firm, for she was no longer a daughter of the Somerville family. She was the keeper of its secrets, and she would face whatever consequences awaited her.